بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد. اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا برحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد. I guess you've all read the description of the session, but we're talking about balance, and I was specifically asked to talk about how do you define balance? How do you define balance, and what happens when you're imbalanced psychologically, emotionally? And you know what, I'm just gonna start with a little, something that's kind of become more relevant for me in the more recently, but we have a lot of people who are falling into one side or another in terms of an extreme position. And what I'm thinking about right now is actually just a friend that I grew up with. I've known him since I was a kid. We grew up together in California. We knew each other, saw each other at different Muslim events, Muslim youth camps. He was active when he got to college, he was active in his MSA. And just recently, he's a doctor now, he's kind of living his life, he's got a wife, a kid, the whole thing. He has started telling us, some of his friends, that he's basically becoming agnostic. And it was like a shock for me to hear this, just given the history of growing up and what he'd been through and where he was. And the thing is, it's not actually, unfortunately, it's not as uncommon as we might think. A few people I've heard of that are close to me or friends have kind of sort of come out and said, I don't really know about this Islam thing. I don't really know about this religious type thing, and are now starting to express, maybe I don't know if I believe in this. And it's, for someone that was, grew up with these people or had known them for years, it's kind of a weird thing to suddenly realize that you're having young Muslims who are not sure if this is what is for them. And one of the things that that this brother would say about why he decided to leave is, he said, I was all these years when I was a Muslim, being a Muslim, I was so overcome with guilt. I was so overcome with feeling guilty if I did something wrong, or if I wasn't being a good Muslim. And I was in constant fear and constant worry, and I just didn't want to deal with it. And it made me re-examine the whole idea about being Muslim and whether or not, and the interesting thing to me is, I was trying to figure out, where did that even come from? Because we grew up and, we would see each other, and I didn't grow up with that type of feeling, that you should constantly feel guilty about yourself and constantly feel fearful about, going into hellfire or something like that. So I was trying to figure out, where did that even come from? Number one, and then number two, he got himself out of that mindset. He came to a point, he said, you know what, I don't need to be overwhelmed with guilt. I don't need to feel worried all the time and fearful all the time, and so he decided to leave Islam. But what's interesting is, I could decide, I don't want to be overwhelmed with guilt. I don't want to be fearful of hellfire all the time. And I can do that whole exercise and still remain within Islam. It's a cognitive process. It's just a thought process you take yourself through. It doesn't necessarily take you out of faith to do something like that, to come to that realization. So I'm trying to come to grips with this idea that for a lot of us, we may be experiencing certain things, but you can go through a process of dealing with it that doesn't necessarily have to threaten the core of who you are as a religious, spiritual person. And that's the dilemma that we're facing now. People they'll throw it all out. If they can't handle one thing about their understanding of the religion, they might just throw the whole thing out, which is it's tragic. Now, it's hard to define when you're well-balanced. When you're a well-balanced Muslim, that's a difficult thing to figure out. what are the bullet points, what are the check marks to make sure you're a balanced Muslim? That's actually quite difficult to define. What's easier to define is just what are the extremes. If you can define what the extremes are and stay away from the extremes, then you sort of naturally can kind of keep yourself in a good balanced middle position. So if we're just in a very basic sense talking about two extremes when it comes to faith, we're talking about basically neglect versus an obsession. These are the two extremes. On one side, you just completely neglect your relationship with God, your own spiritual state, your own spiritual realities, where you're going into the hereafter. You just completely ignore that. Or you become over-obsessed with your spiritual state, your stand before God, whether or not you're worthy enough, whether or not you're going to go to hell, and you become completely obsessed with that. And those two extremes are very bad. Those are, two just rigid places to be spiritually. Many of the scholars, they'll talk about things like it's love versus, and hope versus fear. That you love and you hope, that's your relationship with God, versus a fearful relationship with God, and ideally you should have a little bit of both. The problem, though, with these extremes is you get stuck in a certain pattern. If you start living your life in that fearful way, in a guilt-ridden way, then you get rigid in that path, and then it's hard for you to be flexible. It's hard for you to be flexible. Sometimes you need to be hopeful. Certain situations call for hope. But because you've been in a certain path the whole time, it's difficult for you to get out of that and be hopeful in that moment. And so you don't have that flexibility. You don't have that ability to cope with life's changes, life's circumstances. If you're too far on the I'm in my good times phase, I'm not really thinking about my relationship with God, I'm not really worried about it, everything will be fine, then there are certain situations that call for a little bit of, a little bit of prudence, a little bit of awareness, a little bit of fear. And if you're not flexible enough to meet the demands of that situation, then again, you're going to have trouble coping with the different circumstances of your life. So we have to kind of think about it in this sense. And truthfully, I feel although the guilt side is a big problem, I think the neglect side is a larger issue for us as a community. Most people just don't care. Most people just don't care. We have a certain group of people that are just highly obsessed with their spiritual matters to the point that it's overdone. But that's not like the biggest problem. I don't see that as the biggest issue. The bigger and larger issue are people that just kind of don't really consider it at all. Their state in the hereafter, their relationship with God, that it's kind of like a way backseat issue for them. That I think is a larger thing. But the thing is, the Nephs, the little lower part of your ego that resides within you, it's like a child, and it wants to do what it wants to do. But like any child, a child also wants structure. But they go about seeking it in kind of a weird way. They test your limits. And if any of you have dealt with little children, a young child will always try to test the limits. Am I going to get in trouble for doing this? My son is 2.5 years old now. And I can tell there's a certain look on his face when he wants to test me. Because he'll come up, and he'll come up to like a cup of water, and he knows the cup of water has to be on the table. And he'll pick it up, and he wants to take it over to where the carpet is. And he'll do it like this, and he'll look at me. And he's waiting, and I know he's waiting. Now, why would he do that? If he knows, he just wants to make sure that there's certain structure, there's predictable things in his life. That's what little kids do. They test the limits, they push it, because they want to know at some point, this is where the bound is. This is where I need to be. Your Nephs, your ego, that little desirous little being inside you that calls you to do all kinds of passionate things in your life, it's the same way. It wants to know what are the boundaries. It wants to know, you can't, if you live completely in the side of, I'm just going to serve my ego, whatever I want to do, I'll do, I'm not really going to worry about the consequences, I'm not really going to be concerned with these heavy spiritual matters, then your Nephs will never learn what the boundaries are. And at some point that starts to hurt. It starts to get destructive. One of my teachers, Habib Ali al-Jafri, he said an amazing thing when one of his visits to the States, actually he came to ISNA here in DC years ago when it was here. But they were driving, I think it was a Thursday night, I forget where they were exactly, but it was a college town. They were driving, and in many college towns, Thursday night is the party night, because they don't want the high school kids coming out on Friday night. So Thursday night is party night, and you'll see the clubs and the bars just packed with people and lines coming out the door. So they were driving on the street, and Habib Ali noticed, these lines of people lining up to go into a bar. Long lines. And he looked at them, and then he to the people in the car, he turned and said, what's happening right here? He said, for all these people, their Nephs right now is taking revenge on their intellect. They want to, at the end of the week, all they want to do is just lose the intellect. Get intoxicated. Get in line and go for that. Because during that whole week, the Nephs is is complaining to the intellect, you never once told me what the boundaries are, you never once told me what the structure to this life is. So now, since you haven't given me any spiritual benefit or sustenance throughout this week, at the end of the week, I'm going to take revenge on you. And I'm going to go out and I want to do this. And a lot of our nefsi desires, a lot of our passionate desires and things that we want to do, they're like that. They can be quite self-destructive, even though it comes from within us. Because we don't give it the proper boundaries. So there's a destructive side there. The destructive side, to be over-obsessive, the guilt-ridden side is obvious too. I just gave you an example of this brother, where he just decided to leave the religion altogether. The last thing I'll say is that some people will say, I'm not guilt-ridden. I'm not always fearful of the hellfire. I do things out of love. I do things because I love God, not because I fear Him. And that's beautiful. That's a good thing. I still think there's balance in that. There's a notion of balance in that. Because even the person who says they do things out of love for God, even the person who says they do things, they still have a fear of losing that love, right? Like your beloved, you don't want to lose the favor of your beloved. So there's still, in a sense, they can still also balance between love and fear as well. It's not a complete, black and white type of thing. So if I can just, leave you with any kind of take-home message, is that we are people. We have a tradition of spiritual balance. We have to understand the extremes. What are the extremes and how to avoid them? And if you can do that, even if you can't define what is the middle, you can definitely define the extremes. Those are much more clear-cut. And try your best to stay away from them. And engage in true spiritual work, if you can. Engage in true spiritual work where you can work on some issues, strengthening your relationship with God, strengthening your sense of reliance upon your Lord, strengthening your hope in His mercy, and your desire to please Him and not to displease Him. And we're in a time now where many of us, we might attend a meeting, like an MSA meeting, or do something in activism, and we feel that fulfills our Islamic work for the week. And that's fine, it's good to do those things, but take personal time to look at your own spiritual state.